We just finished talking about editing the toolbar in Photoshop. Now let's talk about some of the blending modes that Photoshop offers that allows us to blend images and layers together in very interesting ways. Now this topic is something that can be very complicated, so at the moment we're going to make it very simple and generally explain what blending modes do with each other and give you a visual reference of what's happening. However, included we're going to have a guide that makes a little bit more sense of the technical details on blending modes. So let's get into it. First of all, I will start with a regular image. Now I will, for the sake of visual representation, stack this image onto this image. So the first thing that we need to know is how do we get this image onto the second image? Well, that's fairly straightforward. What we can do is make a selection of the entire document by hitting Command A, which is Command All, and you can also find that under Select All. Then we will go to Command C or Control C, which is Copy, go over to our second document, and hit Command V or Control V. Then we will move it to where we want to, and as you can see, it stacks on top in a second layer. Now let's say that we want to make these layers interact with each other. We want some of the layer coming through, maybe like a double exposure kind of look. But at the moment, the only thing we know about is opacity and masking. So yeah, we can cut it out manually, but there's many ways to also section it off, and blending modes are the key to making that happen. Now blending modes, as you know, are found under Normal. And when you click on Normal, it opens up a list of many different options. The way this list is separated is first you have a normal category, which obviously nothing happens. This is the stock category. These over here, sectioned off, are darkening blending modes. So they darken the interaction between the top layer and the bottom layer in minute different ways. The second category is lightening blending mode. So they lighten categories. The first column and the second column here are complementary to each other. So darken is opposite of lighten, multiply is opposite of screen, and color burn is opposite of color dodge, and so forth. Next, we have contrast blending modes. So these blending modes themselves will add a lot of contrast to the image overall. Then down here, you have things that invert the interaction, such as difference and exclusion, and then things that basically cancel out each other, like subtraction and divide. And then finally, you have these blending modes here, which we talked about before, such as color. And they take properties of something and add it to the layer below it. So let's talk about these darken modes here. So like I mentioned, the darken blending mode will darken the interaction between the bottom and the top. So for instance, this darken blending mode, what it basically did was the areas of the image on top that were darker than the ones below it got copied over. So for instance, you see that the skin isn't actually being copied over her skin because her skin seems to be already darker than the skin on the top image. The best way to actually understand what's happening is to visualize and see how the interaction is going forward. And as you can imagine, the invert to darken is lighten. So everything that showed through before on lighten is now the opposite. The dark hair, it's not showing through, but the skin itself is showing through. So you have different elements coming into play. Why is this relevant to understand? Let's say you're doing a composite. Let's say you're bringing in a dark sky into a light background. Well, if you end up just using the darken adjustment layer, the sky can easily be placed in no matter how complex the situation, as long as you understand the dynamic of what's happening. Now the other darken modes are things like multiply, which, as you can see, are multiplying the effect of the two dark colors below it. Then there's color burn, which also goes even further and adds saturation shifts, and so forth and so on. And the same thing happens for lighten. Screen is the opposite of multiply, where it's brightening the image on top of blending them together. And the same thing for color dodge. Again, I'm keeping the verbiage very elementary for the sake of understanding what's happening. And you can find more about it with a lot of the material included in this video. Again, now going forward beyond the lightening blending modes, come things like overlay, which add contrast, as you can see, where both of the image are actually coming through, almost like we have a 50-50 opacity, except the saturation and contrast are changing. Soft light tends to be a less contrasty version of overlay, so it's more subtle in effect. And the same thing goes for hard light, vivid light. They just get more and more intense. I feel like if you start with soft light and then go to hard light, then overlay, and vivid light, they're all different steps in how much contrast the blend is applying to itself. Linear light seems to be the hardest contrast blending mode in this contrast group. Hard mix is something that's pretty much unusable, and a lot of these are things that we don't use on a regular basis. However, the way that I personally use this is, like I said, with compositing. We have darker elements and you want to subtract it and add them to areas where there's no sky. Now here are the difference ones. Difference and exclusion being something that just adds different effects. It's almost like a film negative. So where does this really impact us as retouchers or photographers? For instance, let's say I have a blank layer. Now, let's pretend that I want to actually lighten some of the skin and the dress. I can start with something like screen. I can select a white color, and because I know that the light and blending modes are in this category, I can use that combined with the actual color of white to make a better interaction than just using white as a standalone. So lighten basically didn't do anything different than normal, because the color white is going to be lightening whatever else is underneath it that's darker. If I tried to use, say, black to lighten, and I switch this to lighten, it doesn't really lighten anything because black is darker. Let's go back and take off the black. Now, instead of using lighten, we can try doing other things, like maybe soft light. So you can see the soft light blend is a little bit more natural than lighten and all the other lightning blend modes, which just adds a white overlay. But the soft light itself seems to keep the saturation and the color shift of the original skin in mind. And it seems to do a good job of adding a lot of highlights across the image without making it look muddy. This is why soft light is used a lot when you're lighting things with the color white. You can easily use it to also darken by using black and then brushing over areas. And what that does is it darkens and adds dimension. So you can use white and black to add dimension and tonality just depending on where you brush. If I change that over to overlay, it starts adding a lot more contrast and punch to the areas that I started brushing in. And then it changes from there just depending on what blending mode you use. But for me and what I use, for the most part, it stays as soft light when we're brushing different things and you want to add a little more depth with white or black. Another really useful blending mode, personally, is if you want to punch colors up really nicely. Let's say we sample an orange color. We can use screen, and let's say we start brushing in the hair or the dress. What that does is it adds a really nice punch to the areas that you start brushing in, while keeping that color there as well. Sometimes the difference between each of them are quite minor, so I tend to keep it quite straightforward and stick with the basics, which for me seem to be soft light, overlay, screen, and depending on what else I'm doing, darken or lighten. So you can see here, overlay seems to be a really cool punch because I use orange and brushed it in the hair. It added a lot of contrast, but put a lot of gold tones in the hair. My suggestion to you would be play around with this, play around with blending modes, play with colors, and you tend to discover some really cool effects that maybe people haven't discovered yet. That's how I personally learned how to do this. I don't have a technical explanation for every single one, but I do know that in some cases using colors on certain blend modes has different effects. But I like to use adjustment layers more than blend modes for that purpose. One blend mode that I do find useful in retouching and color correcting and things like that are these down here, this hue, saturation, luminosity. For example, hue, what that'll do is, let's say I have my brush tool, I click on option, which brings up my eyedropper, I sample the color that I want to use, and then with my brush tool, if I have it set to 100% flow and I brush, if you notice, if I start brushing over everything, it changes her face and her hair and her limbs to the same tone of orange. The difference between hue and color is that color will take not just the color of the dress, but it also takes the saturation. So when I change that back to hue, you'll notice that it doesn't change the saturation of, say, the hair or the sky or the background. It keeps the sky and the background really desaturated, but it just shifts the actual physical color of whatever it is I'm painting. It doesn't take the saturation of the dress itself. It keeps the saturation of whatever the original subject is. If I change it to just saturation, what happens is the underlying color stays exactly the same, except it'll take how saturated the dress was and amplify that over anything else that was underneath it. So why is this important? Well, it's important for a couple of reasons. Let's say you're working on the skin. Like, there's the blue vein here. What I can do is take the brush, use eyedropper, sample the skin itself. As long as my flow and opacity is 100%, it matches the saturation and the exact color. But if I go to, say, hue, you notice that the saturation of that blue vein stays desaturated, but it does shift that blue to an orange. So that's kind of the effect that it has. And you can play around with it to get an idea of what's happening. And the same thing goes for, say, this area of the glass. Say this is way too saturated. I can bring up a blank layer, change it to saturation. Say I want to desaturate it to something as desaturated as the hair. I can sample that, and as I brush, you'll notice that the saturation of the hair and everything else will be identical. And obviously you don't want it to do that, but all you need to do is drop your opacity or drop your flow to say 3%. And when you start brushing, it'll tone down the saturation of whatever it is that you're painting. And vice versa. If you know that area is really saturated and you like how saturated that is, and you want to match maybe the glasses, you can start brushing with the glasses and you can see how saturated it turns. But it keeps that same original hue underneath, that amber color. If I change it to color, it becomes the color of the actual area that we sample from as well. So you're able to take different property values of where you're sampling from and use that across whatever you're trying to do. So at least the whole takeaway here is you have to have a specific purpose in what you want to do before using these blend modes. Otherwise, they're kind of not necessary. So keep that in mind when you're actually playing with blend modes. Practice, read up, and see what it is that you're looking to do with your creativity with these blend modes as well. For more information on blend modes, please see the attachment in the support documents included in this tutorial. Next, we're going to start talking about Photoshop filters.